If you're bored of being told by prospective clients that you're too expensive or that they don't have the budget to work with you, then this video is for you. I've been there myself. When I was running my agency, I remember how frustrating it was getting on a call with a prospect, knowing that you can help them, knowing that this is exactly what they need, but then at the end of the call, they tell you that they just can't afford to work with you. Whether you say no to that project and you're stressing about where the next one's going to come from, or you say yes to it and then you kind of end up resenting that client a little bit or cutting corners, neither of those scenarios are good. What I want to talk about in this video are 3 key principles that have helped clients like ours, like Alessandro, to take projects from 12K to 25K in just one conversation. These are the same principles that allowed Daniel to increase his rates by over 200% in the last 12 months, and the same principles and strategies that have allowed Will to go from selling £1,500 logos to doing 15K branding projects without 10 times the work. So imagine what it would be like to jump on a call with a prospective client and not be worried about them telling you that you were too expensive, knowing that either that objection's rarely going to come up or that you have the tools and the skills to handle it. So I'm going to doodle a little bit on my iPad, and I'm going to share these principles and these strategies with you from a way that hopefully will make sense in a visual way. So if you want to not get the objection of being too expensive and you want to start charging more money for your work, there are 3 key principles that we need to understand. The first principle is that we need to get clear on the actual problem that we are solving. Now, I know this might seem obvious, but having coached hundreds of award-winning creatives, people at the top of their game creatively, I can tell you that most people do not do this well. And it took me a long time to understand and to learn this in my own business. So let me give you a real-world example. I actually listen to our clients' sales calls. So these are real examples that I hear all the time. Let's take branding as an example. Now, you might get a client coming to you saying, hey, we need a rebrand or we need help with bringing our brand back into the 21st century or something like that. And as a creative, we start asking questions about that. And we say, okay, well, what is it about your brand that you don't like? And why is this important? But most of the time, we're really staying surface level. We're getting caught up in the logistics of the project before we've actually identified the problem. So what we want to get really clear on is, what is the problem that we're trying to solve with a rebrand? Okay. And what are the consequences of not solving this problem? And the second part is where most people just scrape the surface and don't dig down deep enough. So when we're talking about the consequence of a problem, we really want to think about what is the impact in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of reputation, right? What is the impact of having this particular problem? Not the problem of we don't like our brand, but what is the result of not liking your brand? How is that impacting how you're showing up in your sales calls? How is that impacting how you are marketing yourself, right? So what is the actual problem? Well, the problem is that we are lacking confidence in our ability, or when we present to investors, we're lacking confidence because we feel like our brand is outdated and it doesn't compete with our competition. Okay, cool. So the real problem that we're solving is we're solving the problem of confidence in your brand, and we're solving the problem of being relevant in relation to the competition. Like, that's the real problem we're solving. Okay, cool. What is the impact? What is the consequence of that? What is the consequence of not being confident in your brand? How does that show up? How much time does it cost you? How much money does it cost you? How does it cost you in terms of reputation, right? So we're really drilling down, and honestly, this is where most people go wrong. They just don't go deep enough into the problem and the consequence. So that's principle number one, is identify the problem and then drill down. And then on the other side of this, we have the problem is on the left, and then on the right-hand side is the possibility, right? The possibility that opens up if we get this right. So if we had the brand that we wanted, what would become possible? And you can think about this as sort of like the opportunity, or what would become available, what would become possible, what would become available if we managed to solve this problem and you did have the kind of brand that you really wanted. And again, what would become possible in terms of time? What would become possible in terms of money? What would become possible in terms of reputation? What else? What would it mean for you personally? So we really want to go down the kind of pain, pleasure route. And for a lot of creatives, this feels really weird for two reasons. Number one, it feels intrusive. And number two, it's very unnatural because they just want to stay surface level. They want to stay comfortable and they just want to talk about the thing at hand. But I talk about this a lot. It's the difference between having a transactional conversation or a transformational conversation. And if you want to avoid the objection around money, you need to have a transformational problem. Early on in my journey, a mentor of mine called Daniel Priestley once told me that people do not pay big money to solve small problems. And that's always stuck with me. And I've decided from that moment on that I didn't want to be in the business of solving small problems. I only wanted to be in the business of solving big problems. And so if I ever am on a conversation or a call where somebody starts to get a little bit defensive around this, or this feels a little bit prickly, then I will always come at it from that frame, the frame of solving big problems. And I will say to them, the reason I'm asking these questions is because I want to make sure that we are here solving a sizable problem. If it's not a big problem, then it's just not worth investing that time, money, and energy into it, right? So that's why I'm asking these questions. I'm trying to identify the size of the problem, and I'm trying to identify the size of the impact of that problem, both positive and negative. So principle number one is identify the problem. Principle number two is identify the possibility. And we often talk about this as the two islands, which is island A, kind of where are they now and what is the consequence of not changing, and island B, where are they trying to get to? Okay. And so in a sales conversation, this is one of the most important things to do. And it's going to feel unnatural at first, but it's so, so important. So these are the first two consequences. The third principle is the one that really will stop you getting an objection around price. And so before I talk about this principle, I want you to think about something for a minute. If I ask you the question, what is a lot of money? What's the first number that comes into your head? Now, for everyone, that's going to be different. For some people, it's going to be £1,000. For some people, it's going to be £1 million. The point is that a lot of money is relative. So if I said, is £100,000 a lot of money? You might say yes, you might say no. If I said, is £100,000 a lot of money for a penthouse apartment in Mayfair in London? Most people would say no, right? It's an absolute bargain. So what we don't realize is that most of us are consciously or unconsciously comparing money to something. When we hear a number, we're comparing that to something. It might be the money we have in our bank balance. It might be what we think that thing is particularly worth. And I call this an anchor, okay? An anchor is the thing that we are comparing something to. So if we understand that concept, then the third thing that we need to make sure that we do is we need to make sure that we quantify what we've just unpacked here. We quantify the problem and the possibility. And I know I mentioned this down here, but we want to try and get a number here. When I say quantify, I mean, what does this possibility, what does this problem look like in terms of a number? Because we want to create the anchor together with the prospect. We don't want them comparing this to something outside of this conversation. And so one of the things that I say to people, when they say, well, how much is coaching? I said, well, I don't really sell coaching, but I don't ever have a price. I don't ever have a conversation with someone about price outside of the context of value. And what I mean by that is I don't want to talk about money when you don't have anything to compare it to. You don't have a reference, right? So if I just say, well, my coaching costs $10,000, right? Some people might go like, wow, that's a load of money. And other people might go, that seems pretty reasonable. It all depends whether you're comparing it to other coaches, whether you're comparing it to the value that you think that I could bring to your business. Like, it's totally relative. So I want to make sure that when I'm having a conversation with people about money, I'm having the conversation within the context of the problem they're facing and the possibility of what will happen when it's solved. And we can quantify that. And this isn't something where I'm just saying, oh, well, based on what you told me, I think it's worth £1 million. This is actually something that you want to get the prospective client to tell you, okay? You want them to quantify this number. And you can ask them questions. So good questions that I ask them, if we achieved this thing, so if we had this amazing brand that you felt really confident in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? How many more clients do you think you might sign? What kind of level of investment might you be able to raise? What might it do to your pricing? I will ask them quantifiable questions. And so that's why it's always good to know things from prospects like their average customer value or things like their revenue. Because you can ask them these things, right? What do you think by doing this, how will that impact your revenue? How will that impact your average customer value? How will that impact how much money you can raise? And so we're quantifying it. So then when we present our price, it's within the context of the value or the anchor that we've just created. And so that's how Alessandro and these people, our clients, managed to do this, because when the client came to them with 12K, once they had the conversation around possibility and once they had the conversation around problem, first of all, they realized they were trying to solve the wrong problem. And there were a lot of assumptions that they were making about what they were going to do. So Alessandro actually saved them way more than 12 grand. By having that conversation, he was able to point out to them that by spending 12 grand, they weren't going to get what they wanted. And essentially they were just wasting that money. And he helped them to realize that. And so this actually seemed really good value in comparison to if we did things the right way, what that would actually return for the client. So they're the three big concepts. They're the three big ideas that we need to understand, that we need to lean on. We have actually got a framework, which is called the one-page sales framework. It's what we use for our clients. It's what we give them to have these kind of conversations. If you'd like to grab a copy of that, I'll put a link in the description below. It's totally free, but it's a framework, a way to structure calls in alignment with some of the things that we've just talked about. This is specifically around pricing, but the rest of that structure should help. So if you want to grab a copy of that, you can below. But just to recap, there's three key ideas. If you want to stop having people tell you you're too expensive, if you want to be able to kind of charge what you want for your services, there are three big ideas that we need to understand. The first one is that we need to make sure we're solving the right problem, and we really hone in. We cut through all of that kind of like surface stuff up here that they tell us about their brand, and we really get down to like, what is the problem that we're solving at the bare bones of this? Okay, if we solve that problem, what would be possible for them? Okay, so if we solve this problem that we've just identified, not all the stuff that they bring us up here, if we solve the actual problem, what would become possible? And then finally, how can we quantify the value of that? Okay. And I know this is tricky, especially when you're doing things like branding and stuff that feels a little bit intangible, but I know that you can quantify pretty much anything. The most intangible services, I've helped people quantify interior design, I've helped people quantify branding, I've helped people quantify animation. It doesn't really matter what you offer, it doesn't matter how intangible it feels, there's always a way to quantify that. I hope you found this video valuable. If you did, then please hit the subscribe button and I'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.